Deep political divisions and a shockingly narrow divide came to a head in Peru's recent presidential election, and while it's still mired in a messy ballot counting process, Keiko Fujimori is looking more and more like the country's next leader, with some outlets already calling the race for her. Hailing from a Peruvian political family of Japanese descent that ruled the country with an iron grip during the 1990s and has continued to be a major political force ever since, Keiko Fujimori's likely victory is the culmination of her 2-decade struggle for power. But it also marks the triumphant return of her family after the deeply divisive rule of her father, which some say was a time of strength and stability in a troubled nation, while others call it a brutal dictatorship, marked by a coup, violence, and forced sterilization. So who exactly are the Fujimoris? And will their scion seek to lead Peru into a new era or turn back the clock? This is the return of Peru's Japanese political dynasty. While they wouldn't become a household name for another 50 years, the Fujimori family arrived in Peru in 1934 when Naoshi Fujimori and his wife Mutsue immigrated to the country from Kumamoto Prefecture. Between the start of the Meiji era and the beginning of World War II, migration from Japan to the Americas was common, with around 600,000 people arriving in the Western Hemisphere. Roughly half of those went to the United States, and half to various countries across Latin America. The Fujimoris were among the roughly 30,000 Japanese people who ended up in Peru, whose descendants today number around 200,000. In 1938, Mutsue gave birth to a son in Lima, Alberto, the second of the couple's 4 children, who would grow up to become an academic, studying in France and the United States in the 1990s, before returning to Peru in the 70s and eventually becoming an administrator at Peru's National Agrarian University. In 1990, however, Alberto decided to throw his hat into politics, running for president as an outsider at a time of deep economic and political trouble in Peru that saw widespread poverty, a breakdown in support for established political parties, and an emerging Maoist revolutionary movement. Taking advantage of Peru's top 2 presidential election system, where a first round of voting is held with a large number of candidates, before narrowing the field to just 2 if no candidate receives a majority, Alberto Fujimori went from being largely unknown 6 weeks before the first round to securing a spot in the runoff to being elected president of Peru. In a political rise that's been described as rapid and unprecedented, Fujimori presented himself as a centrist technocrat and independent, unburdened by the baggage of established politicians and parties. If you're interested in learning more about Alberto Fujimori's rise and the circumstances surrounding the 1990 election, I'd encourage you to check out Fujimori's 1990 upset victory in Peru, Electoral Rules, Contingencies, and Adaptive Strategies, by Gregory D. Schmidt. Upon resuming the presidency, Fujimori soon began rapid neoliberal economic reforms, reversing much of the state intervention and nationalized industries that defined the Peruvian economy for much of the previous 2 decades. His reforms and privatization efforts have been alternatively described as an economic shot in the arm that boosted the economy and crony capitalism that undermined labor protections and increased inequality. Despite his reforms, Fujimori quickly ran into political deadlock in Peru's Congress, which remained under the control of opposition parties. Claiming that the Congress was obstructing his reforms, as well as efforts to combat the simmering communist revolution, Fujimori staged a coup in 1992, eventually instituting a new constitution that allowed him to stay in power beyond the 5-year term limit, and led his supporters to gain a majority in the legislature. His rule from 1992 onward has often been described as authoritarian and dictatorial, marked by corruption, a decline in freedom, and human rights abuses, including extrajudicial killings amid the dirty war against the Maoist rebels, and the forced sterilization of upwards of hundreds of thousands of indigenous people, ostensibly an effort to combat poverty by limiting family sizes. Fujimori sought a 3rd term in 2000, a prospect that was questionable even under the constitution he had implemented. And while he allegedly won 51% of the vote in a runoff, various irregularities were reported, and over 30% of the ballots were invalidated, at least in part a result of voters marking up their ballots improperly in protest. Mass demonstrations erupted following the results of the election, and fresh evidence of corruption within Fujimori's government. Seeing the writing on the wall, Fujimori fled to Japan, where he successfully claimed citizenship through his parents. While the new Peruvian government pressed charges and sought his extradition, the Japanese government refused, citing a law that generally prevents Japan from handing over its own nationals. Fujimori remained in Japan until 2005, when he suddenly traveled to Chile in an attempt to lay the groundwork for a new bid to return to power in Peru. He was soon arrested by Chilean authorities, however, and spent almost 2 years in police custody there, before being extradited to Peru. In an interesting twist, Fujimori decided to enter Japanese politics while in Chilean custody, joining the People's New Party, a since-defunct small splinter from the Liberal Democratic Party, and announcing a run for parliament in Japan. While the move may have been more of an attempt to gain sympathy and attention across the pond, rather than a genuine foray into Japanese politics, his long-distance campaign ultimately failed. Eventually sentenced to 25 years in prison back in Peru, Fujimori was pardoned and released in 2023, 13 years after his initial arrest, due to health concerns and advanced age. In 2024, Fujimori announced his intent to run for president again in the 2026 election, but he would die just 2 months later, a mere 10 months after he had been released from prison. Despite Alberto Fujimori's track record, his legacy is sharply contested, with many Peruvians crediting him with bringing stability in a time of crisis and looking back on his tenure positively. It's important to note that Fujimori maintained high approval ratings during much of his presidency, despite his authoritarian tendencies, with deep frustration with the political establishment feeling support for his 1992 coup. Even when he eventually resigned and fled to exile in Japan, he was not universally hated, with evidence to suggest that he maintained a base of support, even if it was greatly diminished. And while Alberto Fujimori remains a deeply divisive figure in Peru, his downfall did not spell the end of his family's influence, nor the Fujimorismo ideology that he created. Alberto's younger brother Santiago, who served as an advisor in the elder Fujimori's regime, was elected to Congress in 2006. He was followed by Alberto's son Kenji, who was similarly elected to the legislature in 2011. But Alberto's daughter Keiko Fujimori has proven to be the inheritor of his political movement and legacy. Keiko got her start in politics in 1994, at the age of 19, when her father took the unusual step of appointing her First Lady of Peru, replacing her mother, Japanese-Peruvian politician Susanna Higuchi, after her parents' messy political falling out and divorce. After the end of her father's presidency, Keiko moved to the United States, where she lived until 2005. When she returned to Peru to seek office in order to support her jailed father. Keiko, along with the other Fujimoris and her father's former supporters, created a new political party to back him, winning 13 congressional seats in 2006 and quickly becoming a major political force in the country. But while the other Fujimoris have since retired from politics, Keiko has remained the undisputed leader of the Fujimorist party, Fuerza Popular. Fuerza Popular gained an outright majority in Congress in 2016, and while it lost significant support in 2021, it remains the largest single party and is a part of the ruling coalition. Under the banner of Fuerza Popular, Keiko Fujimori herself has been a candidate in every presidential election since 2011, and has been the second place finisher every time, losing by little more than 0.1% in the 2016 and 2021 races. Now, the 2026 general election is her fourth attempt, and while the ballots are still being counted in an excruciatingly drawn-out process, Keiko Fujimori appears set to win the presidency, marking the return of Fujimorismo to the apex of Peruvian politics. She is in many ways different from her father, however. Far from an outsider like Alberto was in 1990, Keiko is a deeply entrenched establishment figure, with generational baggage and as much experience as any Peruvian politician, despite being only 51. Conservative through and through, Keiko has promised neoliberal economic policies and a tough-on-crime approach that places her in the same camp as the many right-wing figures that have risen to power across Latin America in recent years. But unlike her father, she has made efforts to stress her democratic values, rejecting the authoritarian label and pledging to seek only one term. Above all, Keiko is promising the same kind of strength and stability many credit her father with at a time of crisis in Peru. With Fujimori on track to become Peru's 10th president in 10 years, the country has quite literally had a revolving door of leadership, contributing to its economic, political, and social instability. At the same time, however, Fujimori and her party have also been accused of fueling the political chaos, weaponizing Congress to aggressively pursue investigations and impeachment proceedings against rivals in the president's office. They have repeatedly made use of a vaguely worded clause in Peru's constitution that allows presidents to be impeached for moral incapacity. Though many scholars have interpreted this to be a dated term for mental faculties, the Fujimorist camp has used it to seek the removal of presidents without criminal charges, directly leading to the removal of one president and contributing to the removal of 2 others. So while it remains to be seen exactly what Keiko Fujimori's likely presidency will hold, one thing remains certain. The fate of the South American nation and one family from Kumamoto Prefecture remain deeply intertwined. And even after a dramatic fall from power and 2 decades of failed presidential bids, the Fujimoris aren't going anywhere. Yeah.